The Price of Blood, Part 1, Coming Home. The gates opened at 6:47 in the morning, not with fanfare, not with a crowd, not with anyone waiting on the other side holding a sign or a cup of coffee or a familiar face. The gates of the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center for Women simply swung open, slow and mechanical, the way they had opened and closed 10,000 times before for 10,000 women who meant nothing to the system that held them. Eleanor Voss walked through. She carried everything she owned in a clear plastic bag, $47 in small bills folded once. A photograph the edges gone soft from handling of a man standing in a workshop with sawdust on his shirt and a grin he never wore for cameras. A silver cross on a thin chain, the kind her mother had fastened around her neck on a Sunday morning in 1966 when Eleanor was 12 years old, and the world still made a kind of sense. 20 years behind bars reduced to something that barely weighed a pound. She was 52 when they took her in, young enough to still have color in her hair. Dark brown shot through with early gray, the kind of gray that made her students call her distinguished behind her back and mean it as a compliment. Strong enough to carry a stack of 30 essays up 2 flights of stairs without stopping. Old enough to know that the world was complicated and that people you loved could surprise you in ways you never anticipated. She just had not known, not really, not deep in the bones where truth lives, how dark that surprise could be. Now she was 72. The hair had gone fully silver. The knees ached in the cold, and sometimes for no reason at all. Her hands trembled slightly when she was tired, a tremor the prison doctor had noted in her file 3 years ago, and attributed to stress and age and the body's slow accounting of everything it had endured. She had a heart that skipped beats on staircases. She had 20 years of institutional food in her cells and 20 years of institutional light behind her eyes, that particular fluorescent pallor that never quite left you even when you stepped into real sunlight, which she did now. She stopped just past the gate and tilted her face upward and felt the morning sun on her skin. Not the pale chain-link filtered light of the prison yard. Not the angled rectangle of light that fell through her cell window for 40 minutes each afternoon. Real light, March light, thin and cold but genuine, falling on her without permission or restriction. She stood there for exactly 1 minute. She counted. Then she started walking toward the bus station. The ride from Nashville to Caldwell Hollow took 3 hours on the county bus, 2 transfers, and a 20-minute wait at a gas station outside a town called Birchfield, where a teenage boy behind the counter looked at her plastic bag and her silver hair and her prison-issue shoes and said nothing at all, which was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in years. She sat in the back of the final bus and watched Tennessee roll past the window. It had changed more than she expected. Strip malls where she remembered fields, housing developments pushing into the tree lines, a new overpass where the old Keller Road Bridge used to stand, the one Walter had taken her to on their 3rd date because there was a bend in the creek below where the light hit the water at dusk in a way he said she had to see. She had told him it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She had not been lying. The overpass was concrete and functional and told her nothing about light. She did not cry, did not. She had finished crying somewhere around year 3, in the middle of a February night when the understanding finally settled into her completely, not as an idea, but as a physical fact, the way a stone settles into mud. She had been set up. The sister she loved had looked her in the eye and handed her a flash drive and asked her to promise, and Eleanor had promised, and that promise had cost her everything. She had cried for 2 more years after that, and then she had stopped, and the stopping had felt less like healing and more like the closing of a door. What she thought about now on the bus was not the injustice. What she thought about was the oak tree in the front yard of the house on Orchard Lane. Her great-grandmother had planted it in 1941, the year the war started, as a kind of defiant act of permanence. The tree had been there when Eleanor was born. It had been there when her mother brought her home from the hospital and laid her in the crib beneath the upstairs window. It had been there when Eleanor and Walter had carried their furniture through the front door in 1987, and it had been there presumably through every one of the 7,300 days she had been gone. She wanted to see if it was still standing. The bus dropped her at the Texaco on Main Street at 2:17 in the afternoon. The sun had burned through the morning clouds, and the air smelled of pine and diesel, and something underneath both of those things that Eleanor recognized as home, the particular combination of creek water and red clay and old wood that no other place on earth smelled quite like. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the ground under her feet. Then she started walking. It was 2 miles from the center of town to Orchard Lane. With her knees, it took the better part of an hour. She stopped twice on a low stone wall at the edge of someone's property, sitting with her plastic bag on her lap and her face turned toward the sun, and both times she thought about Walter. She thought about him the way you think about someone when the grief has aged past the sharp stage and become something quieter and more permanent, like scar tissue. She thought about the way he smelled when he came in from the workshop, cedar and linseed oil and honest sweat. She thought about the way he laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, so that by the punchline he was already red-faced and she was laughing at his laughing rather than at the joke itself. She thought about the morning in 2011 when a prison guard had come to her cell and told her in a flat professional voice that her husband had passed away the previous evening of a cardiac event and that she would not be permitted to attend the service. She thought about all of it the way you think about water when you are very thirsty, with a kind of aching precision. She also thought about Gloria. It was impossible not to on this particular walk approaching this particular house. Gloria was 5 years younger, the kind of younger sibling who had always seemed to be catching up, reaching for something just ahead of her that kept moving. Dark-eyed where Eleanor was gray-eyed. Quick where Eleanor was deliberate. The sort of woman who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave it with 3 new friends and 2 business cards and a standing dinner invitation, all without seeming to try. Eleanor had protected her their whole lives. That was simply the shape of their relationship, the older sister holding the door open, paying the extra bill, answering the 2 in the morning phone calls, when the first marriage fell apart, and then the second listening without judgment, lending without expectation of return. She had never once asked herself why Gloria always needed protecting. She had never once asked herself what it meant that a woman in her 40s still called her sister, crying at 2 in the morning, still showed up at her door in crisis, still needed rescuing from one version of her own choices or another. Now, walking down the long slope of Miller Road toward Orchard Lane, Eleanor turned that question over in her mind for the first time. Not with anger, with something more like the careful attention you give a wound you have been refusing to look at directly. What had she missed? She turned onto Orchard Lane, and there was the house. The white farmhouse with the wraparound porch sat at the end of the lane, exactly where it had always sat, framed by the long Tennessee slope behind it and the old split-rail fence along the property edge. The porch had been repainted a brighter white than Eleanor remembered. The flower boxes in the upstairs windows were new dark wood with iron brackets filled with something dormant for winter that would bloom in the spring. The oak tree was there, taller than she remembered. The trunk had thickened over 20 years, the bark gone deeply furrowed and dark, and the crown spread wide against the pale March sky in a way that made Eleanor stop walking and simply look at it for a long moment. Then she saw the mailbox. The old mailbox, the green one Walter had put up the summer of 1989 and repainted every 4 years without fail, was gone. In its place stood a new one, black metal with clean lines, and on its side in neat white letters, Haskell. She saw the truck in the driveway. An F-150, navy blue, well-maintained. A bicycle leaning against the porch railing, child-sized training wheels still attached. A plastic tricycle tipped on its side in the grass near the oak tree. A man came out the front door. He was somewhere in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, the careful movements of someone who paid attention to his surroundings. He wore a canvas jacket and work boots, and he carried a travel mug in one hand. He looked at Eleanor the way you look at something that does not fit the picture you were expecting, with a kind of focused uncertainty. She was standing at the edge of his property, an old woman with a plastic bag and silver hair and prison-issue shoes looking at his house. He came down the porch steps. "Can I help you with something?" he said. His voice was not unkind. Eleanor looked at him. She felt something move through her chest, not quite pain, not quite anger, something older and heavier than either. "This is my house," she said. His name was Dwight Haskell. He was 42 years old, a structural engineer who worked for a firm in Nashville and drove home to Caldwell Hollow every Friday evening and back every Monday morning because he and his wife Nora had decided 11 years ago that this was the kind of place they wanted their children to grow up in. He had 3 children. The third was not yet born. Nora was 7 months along, moving through the house with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had done this before and knew exactly what her body was doing and found it remarkable every time anyway. Dwight did not panic. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Eleanor Voss standing at the edge of his property with her plastic bag and her steady gray eyes, and he said, "Why don't you come inside?" It was not a question. Nora was in the kitchen when they came in. She looked at Eleanor the way a woman looks at something unexpected when she is 7 months pregnant, with a kind of heightened attention, as if her body had turned all available resources toward identifying whether this was a threat or not, and having determined it was not, was now simply absorbing the strangeness of it. "Sit down," Nora said. "I'll make tea." Eleanor sat at the kitchen table. She had sat at this table before. It was not the same table. The table she and Walter had used was a long pine farmhouse table Walter had built himself in 1991, 8 feet long, with a breadboard end and legs that were slightly wider at the base than at the top for stability. He had been proud of that table. Eleanor had been proud of it too. This table was smaller, round, dark wood, probably walnut, store-bought, but quality. 3 chairs and a high chair pushed slightly to one side. She looked at the refrigerator. It was covered in drawings. A horse rendered in orange crayon. A house with a sun in the corner and stick figures out front. A fish. A face that might have been a portrait of someone. She told them everything. She started at the beginning, which was the morning she walked out of prison with $47, and she went straight through to the moment she turned onto Orchard Lane and saw the name on the mailbox. She did not perform emotion. She did not ask for sympathy. She spoke the way she had always spoken, the way 20 years of teaching English had trained her to speak, with clarity and precision and a respect for the listener's intelligence. Dwight sat across from her with his travel mug between his hands and his face doing the work of a man who is processing information that fundamentally alters his understanding of his situation. His expression moved through several stages. Confusion, careful attention, something that looked like the early stages of alarm, not at Eleanor, but at the implications of what she was saying. Nora sat to Eleanor's left. Her hand moved once to her belly and stayed there. When Eleanor finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Dwight said, "I need to show you something." He came back from the study with a manila folder. He set it on the table and opened it and spread out several documents. Eleanor looked at them. She recognized the format of a property deed, the block lettering of an official document, the notary seal. She did not recognize the death certificate until she saw her own name on it. Eleanor Ann Voss, date of birth, March 14, 1954. Date of death, April 7, 2008. The document was official, notarized, countersigned. It listed the county and the attending physician and a cause of death that Eleanor read twice before she could fully absorb it. Cardiac arrest. She had died, according to this document, of a heart attack in the spring of 2008, 2 years after she had been sent to prison. She had been alive in the cell in Nashville when this document was signed. "The woman who sold us this house," Dwight said quietly, "was named Gloria Voss. She said it was the family property and that her sister had passed away. She seemed genuinely grief-stricken." He paused. Our attorney verified the title. Everything appeared legitimate. Eleanor set the death certificate down on the table. "It appeared legitimate," she said, "because my sister spent a very long time making it appear that way." She felt something shift in the room. Not just in the emotional temperature, but in the actual quality of the silence, the way it changed when something irreversible had been acknowledged out loud. Nora said, "She told you I was dead." She had not meant to say it to them. She had meant to say it to herself. But it came out aimed at the room, and when it did, the full weight of it settled on all 3 of them at once. Gloria had not merely stolen the house. She had erased Eleanor. She had walked into a lawyer's office with a forged death certificate and signed over a property and told a young couple buying their first home that her sister was gone, and she had done it with documents that looked real because she had made them real, because she was the kind of woman who could make anything look like the truth. Dwight got up quietly and went downstairs to the basement. He came back 3 minutes later. "There's no safe down there," he said. "There's a furnace and some storage, and that's all." Eleanor had known this was coming. Some part of her had known it from the moment she stepped off the bus. The knowing did not make it easier. "There was $180,000 in that safe," she said. "My life savings." She knew the combination. She was supposed to manage the property taxes while I was gone. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Dwight said, "There's something else." He had been looking at the folder while Eleanor was talking, turning pages, his engineer's mind working through the documents with methodical attention. The account that received the payment from the sale of this property. He turned a page toward her. It's not under the name Gloria Voss. Eleanor looked at the account name. Diana Reeves. She said the name aloud. It meant nothing to her. It had the feel of a name chosen to be easily forgotten, two ordinary words assembled into a combination that would pass without notice through any number of official transactions. She sold the house under her real name, Eleanor said slowly, working through it. But she received the money under a different one. Dwight nodded once. She was preparing to disappear, Eleanor said, before she ever walked into the attorney's office. Before she signed the deed, she had already built the exit. The room held that information for a moment. Then Eleanor folded her hands on the table in front of her, the hands that shook slightly when she was tired, and she looked at the refrigerator, covered in crayon drawings, and she made a decision. She was not going to fall apart. She was 72 years old, and she had spent 20 years surviving something that would have broken most people, and she was not going to fall apart in this kitchen in front of a pregnant woman and a man she had met 45 minutes ago. She was going to make a list. She asked Nora for a piece of paper and a pen, and Nora provided both without comment, and Eleanor sat at the kitchen table that was not her kitchen table and wrote 4 words at the top of a piece of paper. Find the truth first. That night she slept in the room that used to be her sewing room. The room where she had made curtains for the downstairs windows and a quilt for Walter's birthday in 1999 and Halloween costumes for the neighbors' children every October for 15 years running. The room was painted a pale blue now and had a queen bed with a white duvet and framed photographs of the Haskell family's vacations on the walls. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought about Gloria. Specifically, she thought about what she had never let herself think about before. The pattern of it, not the specific betrayal, the setup, the false story, the flash drive, all of that she had turned over in her mind for years. But the deeper pattern, the one that went back much further than September 2006. She thought about the inheritance. Their mother had died in 1995 after a brief illness, and she had left the house to Eleanor and $23,000 in life insurance to Gloria. Eleanor had accepted this without examining it. It was what their mother had wanted. The house had been in the family for generations, and their mother had decided it should stay with Eleanor, and $23,000 was a reasonable sum of money, and that had been that. She had never stood in Gloria's shoes and done the arithmetic. The house in 1995 was worth somewhere north of $200,000, possibly more. The land alone, 3 acres in a county where land was beginning to appreciate, added considerable value. The contents of the house, the furniture and the china and the jewelry and the tools and the workshop equipment were worth tens of thousands more. And Gloria had received $23,000 and a pat on the head. Eleanor had never, not once in the 23 years between 1995 and the moment the police showed up at her door, asked Gloria how she felt about that arrangement. She lay in the blue room in her old house and held that thought and tried to see it clearly without the distortion of her own pain. She was not excusing what Gloria had done. Nothing excused what Gloria had done. But there was a difference between excusing something and understanding it, and Eleanor had spent 20 years in a cell with nothing but time to think, and she was finished refusing to understand things that made her uncomfortable. She thought I protected her whole life. I answered every call. I paid every debt. I lent without counting. And I never once asked whether I had actually hurt her without meaning to. She thought this without sentimentality and without tears. Just with the clear, cold attention of a woman who has decided that the truth matters more than comfort. Then she closed her eyes and slept. She woke before the Haskell household was moving while the house was still in that particular pre-dawn quiet that old houses have, the settling and the sighing of wood and plaster that Eleanor had known all her life. She made coffee with the machine on the counter, moving quietly through a kitchen that was both familiar and strange, and she sat at the round walnut table with her list. By the time Dwight came downstairs at 6:30, she had filled both sides of the paper. He looked at the list and then at her. "You've been up a while," he said. "I need to contact the Tennessee Innocence Project," she said, "and I need access to the county property records for 2007 and 2008. And I need to find out where the account registered to Diana Reeves received its transfers from after 2010. Dwight poured his coffee. He looked at the list again. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll drive you to the library," he said. "They have public records access." And so it began. 3 days later, sitting in the Caldwell County Public Library with Dwight beside her and a stack of printed documents on the table between them, Eleanor learned the full shape of what had been done to her. The account registered to Diana Reeves had received $433,000 in total assembled over the course of 2 years. The house $215,000. The estate sale contents $38,000. Walter's workshop equipment sold to an antique dealer in Nashville $12,000. The life savings from the basement safe $180,000 withdrawn over several months beginning in late 2006, each transaction under the reporting threshold, each one authorized by a power of attorney Eleanor had signed in 2001 when Walter had his first cardiac episode, and they had both wanted to make sure someone could access their accounts in an emergency. She had signed that document at the kitchen table of this very house. She had signed it because she loved her husband and she trusted her sister. Both of those things were still true. One of them had been used to destroy her. She sat with the printed documents arranged in front of her, and she looked at the total $433,000, and she thought about every one of the objects represented in that number. The pine farmhouse table Walter had built. The china her mother had carried carefully from her own mother's house. The pickup truck with the dent in the passenger door from the time she had misjudged the width of the post office parking lot and had laughed about it with Walter for 15 years afterward. Her whole life converted to numbers, and the numbers transferred to an account belonging to a woman who did not exist. She did not cry in the library. But that evening in the blue room, she found something under the edge of the baseboard that had worked loose near the closet door. A single screw, the kind with a square head rather than a Phillips old steel gone dark with age, the kind that had not been manufactured widely since the 1970s. Walter had used that type of screw in the workshop. He bought them by the box from a supplier who was one of the last in the region to carry them. He liked them because they were harder to strip than Phillips heads, and Walter Voss had strong opinions about the things that were worth doing correctly. Eleanor picked up the screw and held it in her palm. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall and the screw in her hand for a long time. When Nora came to tell her that dinner was ready, she found her still sitting there, not crying, just holding a single old screw in her open palm and looking at it with an expression that Nora would describe to Dwight that night as the saddest thing she had ever seen. Eleanor looked up when Nora appeared in the doorway. "Walter used these in the workshop," she said. "He would leave them in his pockets and they would end up all over the house. I was always finding them in the oddest places. Years after he was gone, probably." She paused. "He was gone before I was gone," she said. "They would not let me go to the service." Nora sat down on the floor beside her. She said nothing. She was 7 months pregnant, and sitting on the floor was not comfortable, but she did it anyway. And she sat there with Eleanor in the quiet of the blue room until the light outside had gone fully dark. That was the moment Eleanor understood that she had found something unexpected in the ruins of what her sister had taken from her. Not the house, not the money, something else, something that could not be taken. The next morning, she called Tennessee Innocence Project. Part 2. 20 Years of Lies. Meredith Sloan drove up from Nashville in a car that smelled of coffee and legal briefs. She was 29 years old, small and precise in her movements, with the particular intensity of a person who had chosen her profession out of genuine conviction rather than financial calculation. She shook Eleanor's hand at the door of the Haskell house and looked at her the way lawyers learn to look at clients carefully assessing registering without judgment. Then she looked at the stack of documents on the kitchen table, and something shifted in her expression. 3 hours later, she called a colleague named Conrad Price. Conrad was 58. He had spent 22 years as a special agent with the FBI, the last 8 of them working financial crimes before leaving the Bureau and opening a private practice that specialized in tracking people who did not want to be found. He was built like a former athlete gone slightly to maintenance rather than neglect. And he had the eyes of a man who had spent decades looking at things other people preferred not to see and had made a kind of peace with the habit. He drove up 2 days after Meredith. Eleanor met both of them at the kitchen table. Dwight sat at the corner of the table. Nora moved through the kitchen in the background, making coffee, occasionally stopping to listen. Eleanor was clear from the first moment about the structure of what she was asking. Meredith would handle the legal architecture. Conrad would do the investigation. But every decision, every next step, every choice about what to pursue and what to let go, those belonged to Eleanor. She was not looking to be rescued. She was looking for tools. Meredith accepted this without argument. Conrad looked at her for a moment with an expression that suggested he was recalibrating his initial assessment, and then he nodded once and pulled out his notebook. They started with the documents. The power of attorney that Gloria had used to drain the bank account was legitimate. Eleanor had signed it. The signature was real. The notarization was real. The only fraud was in the intent, and proving intent 20 years after the fact, with the primary witness being the person who had committed it, was exactly as complicated as it sounded. The death certificate was forgery, but sophisticated forgery. The physician listed on it had retired in 2009 and died in 2014. The county seal was accurate. The document number fell within the legitimate sequence for that year and county. Someone had done considerable research to make it convincing. The flash drive was gone. The original evidence from Eleanor's trial was in storage, but a motion to access it would take months. The handwriting on the documents that had convicted Eleanor, the planning notes, the diagrams, the correspondence that the prosecution had claimed was in her hand had been analyzed by a single expert who testified for the state and never challenged by the defense, because Eleanor's public defender had been managing 87 active cases and had allocated by Eleanor's count approximately 4 hours total to her defense. "Tell me about the power of attorney," Meredith said. "When did you sign it?" 2001, Eleanor said. "Walter had his first heart attack that August. Not severe, but severe enough. We wanted to make sure that if anything happened, someone could access our accounts, pay the bills, keep things running. And you named Gloria. She was the only family I had." Meredith wrote something in her notebook. "Had she ever used it before 2006? Not to my knowledge." "Did you know she had access to your account statements?" Eleanor paused. "I did not think about it. We didn't keep financial secrets from each other, or I thought we didn't." She said that last sentence without inflection, just as a fact. Conrad looked up from his own notes. "I want to go back to something," he said. "You mentioned that the flash drive Gloria gave you contained planning documents for the murder, documents that appeared to be in your handwriting. That's what the prosecution said." The defense didn't challenge the handwriting analysis. "No. How many letters or cards had you sent Gloria over the years?" Eleanor thought about it. "Dozens, maybe more. Birthday cards every year, Christmas cards. She went through a difficult period after her second divorce, and I wrote to her fairly often during that time. Long letters, she wrote back occasionally." Conrad looked at her steadily. She had years of samples. The room understood what he meant. Gloria had not needed to be a skilled forger from birth. She had needed patience and practice and a supply of material, and Eleanor had provided all three without knowing she was doing it. "She practiced your handwriting from your letters," Meredith said. She said it flatly, not as a question. "It appears so." Meredith closed her notebook for a moment. She looked at the table, then she looked at Eleanor. "Can I ask you something that isn't strictly legal?" Eleanor nodded. "Did you ever suspect her? At any point before she handed you the flash drive, did anything feel wrong?" Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She looked at the window at the pale March light coming through the glass at the yard where the oak tree stood against the sky. "There was a moment," she said slowly. "The night she came to the door, she was crying. Her mascara was running. Her hands were shaking." She paused, but her eyes weren't red. The kitchen was quiet. "I noticed it, and then I dismissed it," Eleanor said, "because she was my sister, and she was crying, and I had always been the one who answered when she cried." She looked back at the table. "That was the moment. I had it, and I chose not to follow it." She said this without self-pity, as a fact, as an accounting. Conrad's report came in stages over the following 10 days, and each stage added a new dimension to the picture of what Gloria had built. The first report confirmed the timeline of the Diana Reeves identity. The name and its associated Social Security number had been registered in 2004, 2 years before Howard Crail's death. 2 years before Gloria had appeared at Eleanor's door with mascara running and a story about dangerous men and gambling debts. Gloria had not invented Eleanor's role in the murder when she needed a scapegoat. She had invented it before she needed anything at all. Eleanor read Conrad's report at the kitchen table while Dwight made breakfast, and Nora sat across from her with a cup of decaf, and she sat with the information for a long time before she said anything. She was planning this before Howard Crail was dead, Eleanor said. Nora said, "What does that mean?" "It means I wasn't a convenient solution to a problem," Eleanor said. "I was always the plan." That evening, Eleanor sat alone in the blue room for the first time with no paper to write on and no list to make. She sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap, and she thought about Walter dying alone in a hospital in 2011 while she sat in a cell 40 miles away. She thought about the years she would never recover, the springs and summers and falls, the graduations of students she had taught who had gone on and done things she would never know about, the neighbor's dog that used to come through the broken section of the back fence and sleep on the porch on warm afternoons. The way the light moved through the kitchen in the late afternoon in October, when the leaves on the oak tree had just started to turn. She thought about the fact that her sister had looked at all of this at Eleanor's entire life and had seen not a person but a resource. She was sitting there in that particular quality of quiet when Nora knocked softly and pushed the door open. Nora said nothing. She walked in slowly, both hands on her lower back in the posture of late pregnancy, and she went to the armchair by the window and lowered herself into it and looked at Eleanor. They sat in the blue room together in the dark without speaking for 20 minutes. When Eleanor finally looked over at her, Nora said, "You don't have to explain anything." "I know," Eleanor said. "Thank you." They sat for a while longer. Then Eleanor said, she had been planning it for 2 years before it happened. She built the identity, she built the exit. And then she came to my door and cried, and I let her in. Nora looked at her. "I would have done the same thing," Eleanor said, "even if I had known. Even knowing what I know now, if she had come to my door in that state, I would have let her in." She said this not as a confession of weakness, but as a statement of who she was. A woman who opened doors for people who came to them in trouble. A woman who answered calls in the night. She had been exactly that person her entire life, and the understanding that this quality had been the instrument of her destruction did not make her want to become a different person. It made her soft in a way that had no bottom. The second report from Conrad arrived a week later. He came to the house in person to deliver it, which told Eleanor, before he said a word, that the contents were significant. He sat at the kitchen table with Meredith on one side and Eleanor on the other, and Dwight at the far end, and he spread several printed pages across the table's surface. Howard Crail, he said, had not been a random target. Howard Crail had been Gloria's boyfriend for 11 months before his death. Eleanor looked at Conrad. Then she looked at the documents. Howard Crail, 54, a property developer based in Nashville, had been in a relationship with a woman named Gloria Voss for the better part of a year. They had been seen together publicly on multiple occasions. Several of Crail's associates had been aware of the relationship. His wife had not been. When his wife discovered the affair, she had threatened divorce proceedings that would, given the nature of Tennessee marital property law and the length of their marriage and the value of Howard Crail's assets, have left him with considerably less than half of what he had. Crail had panicked. He had told Gloria the plan was off. The relationship was over. He was going back to his wife. He had said this in a restaurant in Nashville on a Tuesday evening in August 2006. 6 weeks later, he was dead. The life insurance policy on Howard Crail was for $2 million. His wife was the primary beneficiary. The secondary beneficiary, the person who would receive the full amount in the event that the wife was also deceased or was legally implicated in the death, was listed as a woman named Diana Reeves, a social security number that had been assigned to Gloria Voss in 1972. The kitchen was completely silent. Eleanor looked at the name on the document. Diana Reeves, the same account that had received $433,000 from the liquidation of her entire life. The same identity that had been created in 2004, 2 years before any of this began. "She didn't frame me because she needed someone," Eleanor said finally. Her voice was steady. "She framed me because I was the most effective option. She had time to choose." "That's correct," Conrad said. "She knew I would believe her. She knew I had the account she could access. She knew I had no alibi for that night because I was grading papers alone at home. She knew everything about my life that she needed to know because I had never kept anything from her. Meredith said the man who actually killed Howard Crail Terry Boggs was paid $8,000 in cash. The serial numbers on the bills were traced to withdrawals from your account made possible by the power of attorney. Eleanor looked at the table. She used the document I signed because I was afraid of losing Walter. She said to have a man killed and then to make it look like I paid for it. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she said, "Where is she now?" Conrad turned to the last page of his report. "Scottsdale, Arizona," he said. "A private gated community called Desert Crown Estates. She's been living there for approximately 6 years under the name Diana Reeves, married to a man named Gerald Sutton. Retired surgeon. Considerable assets." He paused. "There's something else you need to know." He looked at Eleanor with the careful directness of a man who had delivered difficult information many times and had learned not to soften it beyond the point of honesty. She was diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer 8 months ago. She's currently in treatment, but the prognosis is not optimistic. The physicians consulted by my contact estimate between 4 and 8 months. The kitchen absorbed this. Meredith said quietly, "Eleanor, this changes the legal timeline considerably. If she passes away before we can obtain a statement or testimony, the evidentiary value of what we have is reduced significantly. We have strong circumstantial evidence. We have the documented identity of Diana Reeves. We have the financial trail. But a recorded confession or direct testimony would be the difference between a petition that succeeds in 6 months and one that could drag on for years." Eleanor looked at the table for a long time. Then she looked at Meredith. "You want me to go to Arizona?" "I want whatever you decide," Meredith said. "I want to tell you what the legal situation is, and I want you to make the decision." Eleanor stood up slowly. She went to the window and looked out at the yard. The oak tree stood against the late afternoon sky, the bare branches just beginning to show the first suggestion of buds, weeks yet from opening but present. She stood there for a long time. "She built her whole life on other people's trust," Eleanor said. "On mine especially. And she's dying in a house full of things that can't love her back." She was quiet. "I need to ask her why." Meredith started to speak. "Not for the legal case," Eleanor said. "For me. I need to look at her and ask her, and I need to hear the answer in her voice in a room where she can't edit it or manage it or perform it." She turned from the window. "After 20 years, I've earned that." The room held the weight of what she had said. Dwight, who had been silent through most of the meeting, said, "Then we'll get you there." Nora said from the corner, where she had been listening, "Come home safe." Eleanor looked at her, at this woman she had known for 3 weeks, who was 7 months pregnant, who had found an old woman at the edge of her property, claiming the impossible, and had brought her inside and made her tea and sat beside her in the dark without being asked. "I will," Eleanor said. Part 3. Face to face, the plane banked south over Nashville, and Eleanor looked down through the window at the city spread beneath her and thought, "I have never seen it from here before." 40 minutes later, they were over the green and brown patchwork of northern Tennessee, and then the land began to flatten, and the color changed, and by the time they crossed into Texas, the world below had gone brown and vast in a way that felt like a different country. Eleanor had lived her entire life within 50 miles of Caldwell Hollow. She had driven to Nashville for concerts and to Memphis for a conference, and once in 1994 to Gatlinburg with Walter for a long weekend that she still thought of as one of the best 4 days of her life. She had never been on a plane. She watched the landscape move beneath her with the attention of someone who understands that they are experiencing something for the first time, and she thought about Walter. He would have narrated this. That was what he did when they drove anywhere new. He narrated, pointed at things and gave them context and history, and sometimes made up context and history when he didn't have the real kind. And she had always known when he was making it up and had never stopped him, because the invented version was usually better than the truth anyway. He would have had something to say about the moment the land went from green to brown, about the specific mile at which Tennessee became something else. She said it to herself instead, in his voice, the way she sometimes did when she needed to think through something difficult. Meredith sat beside her with her laptop open, working through documents. She had been awake since 5 in the morning. She had the particular focus of a person running on caffeine and conviction. When the fastened seatbelt light came on for the descent into Phoenix, she closed her laptop and looked at Eleanor. "Are you ready?" she asked. Eleanor thought about the question honestly. No, she said, but that hasn't stopped me yet. The heat of Phoenix hit Eleanor like a physical force when they walked out of the terminal. Dry and enormous, nothing like the humid Tennessee summer she had grown up in. Even the smell was different. Dust and sage and something mineral underneath like the earth exhaling. They rented a car. Meredith drove. They went north toward Scottsdale on a freeway that looked to Eleanor's eyes like it had been designed by someone who had never considered the possibility that a person might want to feel connected to the place they were moving through. Everything was wide and fast and made of concrete. Desert Crown Estates sat behind a wall at the end of a long entrance road lined with palm trees. The gate had a guard booth with a uniformed attendant. Meredith had called ahead using the name of a charitable organization that Diana Reeves Sutton had donated to once in 2022, asking to confirm an appointment regarding a recognition for Mrs. Sutton's philanthropic contributions. The guard checked his clipboard and made a call and waved them through. The house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, single-story sprawling with a red tile roof and a circular driveway, and a fountain at the center of the front yard where water fell over stacked stone in a sound that was meant to feel peaceful, and instead in the middle of this manufactured landscape felt like an argument. Meredith parked. They sat for a moment. Eleanor looked at the house. She thought about the 43 years since she and Gloria had been children sharing a bedroom in a farmhouse 20 miles east of Nashville. She thought about the $47 in her plastic bag. She thought about Walter's screw in her palm. Then she got out of the car and walked to the front door and rang the bell. The footsteps that came were slow, careful. The footsteps of someone managing pain. The door opened. Gloria Voss was 67 years old and dying, and it showed. She was thin in a way that was not her natural shape, her face gaunt, the skin of her neck loose and slightly yellowish from the medication. She wore a silk scarf wrapped around her head in the way of a woman who has made peace with what is visible and has decided to make it elegant anyway. But her eyes were the same as they had always been. The pale blue of their mother's eyes. Sharp and bright, and Eleanor saw now with complete clarity, cold in a way she had always mistaken for something else. Strength, confidence, independence. It was not any of those things. Gloria looked at her for a moment. Then something passed across her face that Eleanor could not immediately name, and then she recognized it. Not fear, not guilt, relief. Ellie, Gloria said. Her voice was thinner than Eleanor remembered, slightly rough at the edges. I was wondering when you'd find me. The sitting room had white leather furniture and pale stone floors, and a wall of windows that looked out over a swimming pool, and beyond it the desert. The view was large and empty and expensive, the kind of view that costs a great deal to purchase and provides very little warmth once you own it. Gloria moved slowly to an armchair and lowered herself into it. Eleanor sat on the sofa opposite her. Meredith sat to one side and set her phone on the arm of the sofa with the recording application running. She had disclosed this to Gloria at the door. Gloria had looked at the phone and then looked at Eleanor and said, "It doesn't matter." "Tell me," Eleanor said. "Not how could you, not do you know what you did to me, just tell me," because that was what she was here for. Gloria looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the desert through the glass. "Mama left you the house," she said. "The house and everything in it, and the land and the furniture, and the jewelry and the tools, and everything that had been in that family for 80 years. She paused. "She left me $23,000. "I know," Eleanor said. "You never questioned it." "No, I didn't." Gloria looked back at her. "That's the part you don't understand. Not that you got more. The part you don't understand is that you never even thought to question it. You accepted it the way you accepted everything. It was simply what was. It was simply what you were entitled to." Eleanor said nothing. "I had 2 failed marriages," Gloria said. "I had jobs that led nowhere. I had a life that kept not working out no matter what I tried, and every time I came back to you, you helped me. You were generous. You were kind. You never once made me feel small for needing help." She paused. "And somehow that made it worse. Because I wasn't asking for your charity. I was asking for what should have been mine." The room was quiet. "Howard," Eleanor said. Gloria was still for a moment. "He was going to leave his wife," she said. "We had plans, real plans, a real life somewhere else, somewhere away from all of it. away from the history and the accumulation of every failure. And then she found out, and he panicked, and he sat across from me in a restaurant and told me it was over. She said the last three words with a flatness that was worse than anger. You decided not to accept that, Eleanor said. I had built the identity already. Diana Reeves, I had built it 2 years before as protection as an OI exit in case I needed one. I had already thought through the insurance policy. I had helped Howard set up the secondary beneficiary clause, told him it was just a formality that it would simplify things if something happened. He trusted me. She looked at Eleanor directly. Everyone trusted me, she said. I was very good at being trustworthy. Eleanor looked at her, at this woman who was her blood, her childhood, her history, at the face that was so familiar and so strange. Why me, Eleanor said. Specifically, you needed someone who would take the flash drive. You needed someone without an alibi. But there were other people you could have used. Gloria was quiet for a long moment. Because you would believe me, she said. Not just believe the story, you would believe me. If I cried, you would come. If I was in danger, you would help. If I handed you something and asked you to keep it safe, you would keep it safe without looking too closely. She paused. You were the only person in my life who had ever loved me without reservation. And that made you the most useful person I knew. The sitting room was absolutely still. Eleanor looked at her sister. At the woman who had taken her house, her money, her husband's final years and 20 years of her life. At the woman who was dying in a beautiful room full of things that could not love her back. Do you regret it? Eleanor asked. Gloria was silent for a long time. She looked at the desert through the glass. The light was going golden outside the long Arizona afternoon heading toward evening. I regret, she finally said, that it is ending like this, that I am in this room alone. She turned her eyes back to Eleanor. But no, not the rest. Then something shifted in her expression, something that was not remorse, but it was perhaps the closest to it that Gloria Voss was capable of reaching. You know what I've been unable to stop thinking about, she said. In the last 8 months lying in these rooms, while the treatments take what they take. She looked at Eleanor with the pale blue eyes they had inherited from the same woman. The way you are here, right now, looking at me the way you're looking at me. Not with hate, not with satisfaction that I'm suffering. She paused. You're looking at me the way you've always looked at me, like you still see someone worth looking at. She shook her head slightly. I had $10 million, she said. I had this house. I had every material thing I ever said I wanted. And I am going to die in a hospital room with no one who knows my real name anywhere near me, because I spent my entire life taking from people instead of building anything with them. She was quiet. You lost everything, and you have more than I will ever have. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood up. She stood in the center of the white sitting room with the pale stone floors and the expensive view. And she looked at her sister and she said, "Goodbye, Gloria." She did not say, "I forgive you." She did not say, "I hate you." She said the only true thing she could say, which was goodbye, and she said it with the same clarity she had brought to everything else. No performance, no withholding, just the simple fact of an ending. She walked to the door. She did not look back. In the car, Meredith pulled up the recording on her phone and confirmed that the audio was clean. Every word, the identity, the premeditation, the 2-year construction of Diana Reeves before the murder, the insurance policy, the conscious choice of Eleanor as the person who would carry the weight. All of it was there. Meredith said, "It's enough." Eleanor looked out the passenger window at the desert rolling past as they drove back toward the highway. She said, "I was the most useful person she knew," Eleanor said. Meredith waited. "I want to be useful," Eleanor said. "Just not to her. Not anymore." The petition for exoneration was filed on the first Monday in April. Meredith had pushed for expedited review, citing the recorded confession, the documented fraud, the power of attorney abuse, the forged death certificate, and the independent analysis of the handwriting samples, which confirmed that the planning documents used to convict Eleanor were not written by Eleanor's hand. The review took 4 months. In the middle of June, Eleanor received word that Gloria had been admitted to a hospital in Scottsdale. Gerald Sutton had filed for divorce the week after Eleanor's visit, when Meredith had forwarded the relevant portions of the recording to his attorney. Gloria's assets were frozen pending the fraud investigation. She had nothing left that could be converted to warmth or companionship. In the middle of July, Eleanor stood in a courtroom in Nashville, the same building though not the same room as the one where she had been convicted 20 years earlier. Meredith stood beside her. Dwight and Nora sat in the gallery. Nora very close to her due date, having driven up from Caldwell Hollow because she had decided she was going to be there, and that was that. The judge was a woman in her 50s who had read every page of the petition and the supporting materials, and who, when she looked at Eleanor over her reading glasses, had something in her expression that was not quite pity, but was in the neighborhood of it. She read the findings aloud: the fraudulent evidence, the perjured testimony, the systematic construction of a false case against a woman who had trusted her sister. She said, "Miss Voss, on behalf of the state of Tennessee, I extend our most sincere apology for the profound injustice done to you by this court 20 years ago." She struck the gavel. "Eleanor Ann Voss, your conviction is hereby vacated in full. You are exonerated of all charges. This court finds you wholly and completely innocent." The gallery made sound. Meredith made sound. Dwight made sound. Eleanor stood very still. She felt the words land somewhere in her chest and settle there, not with the crash of something dramatic, but with the quiet weight of something that has always been true finally being said aloud. She nodded once. "Thank you," she said. She meant it for the judge, but she also meant it for something larger and harder to name. For the 20 years that had not broken her. For Dwight and his careful engineer's attention to documents. For Nora sitting on the floor of the Blue Room without being asked. For Meredith, 29 years old, running on coffee and conviction. For Walter's screw. In the second week of August, she received a call from a hospital administrator in Scottsdale. Gloria had died the previous evening. Peacefully, the administrator said, which Eleanor understood, was the word used when there was nothing more specific and accurate to offer. There had been no family present. The body would be cremated by the county. Eleanor set the phone down on the kitchen counter of the small house she had rented in Caldwell Hollow, 8/10 of a mile from the farmhouse on Orchard Lane. She looked out the window at her back garden. She had planted roses and marigolds in late April, and they were blooming now with the particular extravagance of things that had been properly tended. She stood at the window for a while. She thought about Gloria. She thought about the white sitting room and the desert light and the pale blue eyes that had been cold in a way she had mistaken for something else for 50 years. She thought about the $23,000 and the house and the arithmetic that had curdled into something monstrous over decades of silence. She thought, "I hope at the end it was peaceful in whatever way it can be peaceful to leave a world you have taken from rather than added to." She did not feel satisfaction. She did not feel vindication. She felt something that was a long way from either of those things. Something that was closer to the deep tiredness of an account that has finally been settled, and underneath it, something quieter and more durable. She went outside and watered the roses. The civil settlement came through in September. The estate of Gloria Voss, frozen pending the fraud proceedings, was ultimately valued at $612,000 after Gerald Sutton's divorce settlement and the legal fees. Eleanor received $480,000 as restitution. It was not the full amount of what had been taken. It was never going to be the full amount of what had been taken. She used a portion of it to buy the small house she had been renting, the one with the back garden and the window that faced east, the one that was 8/10 of a mile from the oak tree. She was sitting on the porch of that house one evening in early October when Dwight called. Nora had delivered their daughter that morning, 6 pounds, 4 ounces, healthy, beautiful. They had named her Rose. Rose Eleanor Haskell. Eleanor sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended and looked at the October sky over the Tennessee hills, the particular deep blue of an autumn evening that she had missed for 20 years, without knowing exactly how much she had missed it. She felt something move through her chest that she had no name for, something that was not quite joy because it was too heavy for that, and not quite grief because it was too warm, something that was both of those things alloyed into something new. She thought about Walter. She thought about his grin and his sawdust and his invented narrations and the square-headed screw. She thought about how he would have responded to this evening, this phone call, this name. He would have laughed until he was red in the face. Then he would have been very quiet for a moment and said something that was entirely true and entirely him, and she would have known it was true because it was him. She said it to herself instead, in his voice. "She's going to be all right," Walter said. "You both are." In the mornings now, Eleanor woke early and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with whatever she was writing. She had started a letter months ago. Not a memoir, not a legal document, not anything with official weight. Just a letter. To the women who were still in cells. To the ones who lay awake at night, turning questions over in their minds that had no answers. To the ones who had been loved badly by people they trusted completely. She wrote, the years are not coming back. I know that. But here's what I know about what comes after. She wrote every morning. The letter grew longer. It became something she did not have a name for yet. On a Sunday morning in early November, she drove the 0.8 of a mile to the house on Orchard Lane. She drove past it slowly and stopped at the edge of the property and looked at the oak tree in the front yard, and its branches gone bare now, the furrowed trunk thick and dark against the pale sky. The farmhouse behind it was white and well kept and had flower boxes in the upstairs windows that would bloom again in the spring. She looked at it for a long time. She had chosen not to take it back. Not because she could not have. Legally, after the exoneration and the settlement, the case for reclaiming the property would have been strong. She had been advised of this. She had decided against it. Because Dwight and Nora had lived here for 17 years. Because their children had been born in this house. Because the oak tree her great-grandmother had planted in 1941 had grown in the presence of another family's love and noise in ordinary life, and that was not nothing. That was perhaps exactly what her great-grandmother had planted it for. She sat in the car and looked at the tree for a while. Then she drove home. That evening, she sat on the porch of her small house with the back garden and the eastward window as the sun went down over the Tennessee hills. She had a cup of tea. She had her notebook. She had the silver cross on its thin chain around her neck, the one her mother had clasped there in 1966 when the world still made a kind of sense. The world made a different kind of sense now, a harder, truer kind. She thought about Gloria in the white sitting room, saying, "Oh, you have more than I will ever have." And she thought about whether it was true, and she concluded that it was. Not because of the house or the money or the exoneration, not because of any of the things that could be measured or transferred or put into a manila folder on a kitchen table. Because of the way Nora had sat down on the floor of the blue room without being asked. Because of the way Dwight had said, "I'll drive you to the library without making it a favor." Because of the name Rose Eleanor Haskell. Because of Walter's screw still in the pocket of the jacket she wore every day. She had lost 20 years. She had lost her husband's last years. She had lost the house and the money and the ordinary continuation of an ordinary life that she had built carefully and honestly and without harm to anyone. But she had not lost the thing Gloria had said she envied most. The capacity to love without reservation, to show up for people, to answer when someone knocked in the dark. Gloria had used that quality to destroy her, and it had survived the destruction. It had, in fact, been exactly what had rebuilt her. She wrote that in her notebook. She wrote it plainly without decoration, the way she had always written and taught, and spoken with clarity and respect for the truth. Then she set the notebook on the arm of the chair and looked at the evening sky. The first stars were beginning to show. In Tennessee in November, they came out early, sharp and bright against the darkening blue. She could see them appearing one by one as the light fell, each one becoming visible. At the moment the sky was finally dark enough to show it, each one having been there all along. She sat on her porch and watched them come out. She thought, I am 72 years old, and I have lost more than most people lose, and I have more than most people have, and I am sitting on my own porch in the dark on a November evening in Tennessee, watching the stars come out. I am, she thought. That is the whole sentence. I am. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.